She walked into the restaurant wearing shoes that were falling apart at the seams. Within minutes, the richest man in the room would humiliate her in front of 40 strangers because of them. He had no idea she held the power to end his career before dessert was even served. And when his own driver looked up from across the room and saw her face, he did not see a woman to laugh at. He saw a name he had spent 6 years praying he would never have to say out loud again. By the time the night ended, one of them would be unemployed. It would not be her. Before we go into the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The Kingsley Room sat on the top floor of the Ashford Grand Hotel, the kind of restaurant where the menus had no prices and the waiters memorized your name before you sat down. Grace arrived a few minutes past 7, her coat buttoned to her chin, her shoes scuffed white at the toes from years of walking her son to school and back because the car had been sold 2 winters ago. She had not chosen this restaurant. A letter had. A letter from a law office she had never heard of, asking her to be here, tonight, at this table, for reasons it refused to explain on paper. She gave her name at the host stand and was led toward a table near the window, past groups of men in tailored suits who did not look up from their wine glasses. Grace kept her eyes forward and her hands folded, the way she had trained herself to do in rooms like this. Rooms that made it clear within seconds she did not belong. She had learned long ago that dignity was not about the shoes on your feet. It was about how steady you stood in them. Tonight, that steadiness was about to be tested by a man who had built his entire identity on making sure no one ever forgot the difference between people like him and people like her. Nathaniel Cross held court 3 tables away, laughing loudly enough that the sound bounced off the marble floor. He was the CEO of Ashcroft Industries, a company that had once belonged to a man Grace knew better than anyone alive, and Nathaniel wore that title the way some men wear cologne, applied heavily, meant to be noticed from across a room. He was mid-story to a group of investors when his eyes drifted toward the window table and landed on Grace's shoes. He stopped talking. He smiled the way a man smiles right before he says something he thinks is clever, and the whole table turned to see what had caught his attention. "I'm sorry," Nathaniel said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "But is this a restaurant or a shelter tonight?" A ripple of laughter moved through his table. Grace did not flinch. She had heard worse from smaller men. "Those shoes look like they walked here from another decade," he continued, standing now, savoring the attention the way he savored everything, a stage built for him wherever he happened to be standing. "Someone should tell whoever let her in that the Kingsley Room has a dress code." His investors laughed harder. A waiter near the kitchen door lowered his tray and stared at the floor, uncomfortable but silent, because men like Nathaniel Cross did not get corrected in rooms they were paying for. Grace set her water glass down slowly and looked at him, not with anger, but with something closer to recognition, the way you look at a storm you have already survived once before. "They're not that old," she said evenly. "I've just had more important things to spend money on than shoes." The table went quiet for half a second before Nathaniel laughed again, waving a hand at his colleagues as if to say, "Watch this," and stepped closer to her table, clearly deciding the night needed more of a show. "Let me guess," he said, looking her over. "Waitress?" "No, you're too old for that. Cleaning crew, maybe, here to pick up extra shifts." 2 of his investors chuckled, though one, a woman near the end of the table, had stopped smiling and was watching Grace's face with a different kind of attention. "I run a company worth more than this entire block," Nathaniel continued. "And I promise you, whatever job you have, it does not pay enough for you to be eating in a room like this." He reached for his wine glass, pleased with himself, already turning back toward his table, already certain the conversation was over and he had won it. A man at the next table, someone Grace didn't know, leaned toward his companion and murmured that this was the most entertainment he'd had all week, and his companion laughed the kind of laugh that made it clear neither of them had ever once had to wonder whether their shoes were acceptable in a room like this. A woman near the bar lifted her phone slightly, angling it toward the scene, the way people do when they sense something is about to become a story worth telling later. though she lowered it just as quickly when a manager approached and asked, quietly, whether everything was all right at the table, more concerned about the reputation of the restaurant than about the woman being humiliated inside it. Grace noticed all of it. She simply chose not to react to any of it. That was when Marcus Doyle, standing quietly by the door where he had been waiting to drive Nathaniel home, looked up from his phone toward the commotion and saw her face clearly for the first time. His entire body went still. The color drained from him so fast that the coat-check attendant beside him asked if he was all right, and Marcus did not answer, because his mouth had gone dry and his mind had gone straight back 6 years, to a house he used to drive to every morning, to a man who used to sit in the back seat reading financial reports before sunrise, to a daughter who used to wave from the porch before the world she knew fell apart in a single afternoon. Marcus crossed the restaurant floor faster than a driver has any business moving, reaching Nathaniel's shoulder and leaning in close, his voice low but urgent enough that Nathaniel's smile faltered before a single word was said. "Sir," Marcus whispered, "you need to stop talking right now." Nathaniel turned, irritated at the interruption to his performance. "I'm handling something here, Marcus." But Marcus did not step back. His eyes kept flicking toward Grace, toward the woman standing calmly by the window table as if none of this had touched her at all, and his voice dropped even lower, shaking slightly. "That's not just some woman, sir. That's Ashcroft's daughter. That's Grace." The name hit Nathaniel like a slap he never saw coming. He turned fully toward Grace, studying her face as if searching for a resemblance he had spent years being told did not matter anymore. A face from old photographs that used to hang in the executive hallway before he had them quietly taken down. "That's not possible," he said, though his voice had lost its performance entirely. "Grace Ashcroft left the company years ago. She's not. She wouldn't be here, not like this." Marcus said nothing else. He didn't need to. The fear on his face was answer enough, and around them, the investors who had been laughing moments earlier had gone completely silent, sensing that something had shifted in the room that none of them fully understood yet. Grace finally spoke, her voice calm, almost gentle, the way you speak to someone who has just realized the ground beneath them is not as solid as they believed. "Hello, Nathaniel," she said. "It's been 6 years." She reached into her worn coat pocket and placed a single folded letter on the white tablecloth in front of him, the same letter that had brought her to this restaurant tonight. "You should probably read that before you say anything else." Nathaniel stared at the paper as if it might bite him. His investors exchanged glances, no longer laughing, no longer certain who exactly they were sitting with tonight, or what they had just watched unfold in front of 40 witnesses and a very still, very frightened driver. Grace's phone in her coat pocket while Nathaniel stared at the folded letter, and she glanced at it briefly out of habit. A text from her son, 12 years old and waiting at home with a neighbor, asking what time she'd be back and whether she'd remembered to pick up his library book. It was a small thing, the kind of ordinary worry that had nothing to do with boardrooms or trust funds, and it steadied her more than anything else could have in that moment. A reminder of exactly why she had spent 6 years staying quiet, working 2 jobs, letting the world assume she was simply another woman who'd fallen on hard times instead of a woman who had chosen, deliberately, not to fight a battle until she had every weapon she needed to win it outright. He unfolded the letter with hands that were not as steady as they had been 10 minutes earlier. It was written on the letterhead of Rowe and Callahan, the law firm that had handled Walter Ashcroft's estate since before Nathaniel had ever set foot in the company. His eyes moved down the page, and whatever color remained in his face left it completely. "This says the emergency board meeting tomorrow morning is about the trust," he said quietly, as though saying it aloud might make it less true. "It says the trust becomes active tomorrow. It says—" He stopped himself, looking up at Grace with something that had replaced his earlier cruelty entirely, dread. "This isn't real," he said. "My lawyers would have told me." "Your lawyers didn't know," Grace said, taking the seat across from him now, uninvited but unbothered, the worn shoes tucked beneath the table where they no longer mattered to anyone in the room. "Because you made sure the people who did know were pushed out, fired, or silenced years ago. My father built a clause into his trust that only 3 people alive ever knew about: his attorney, his accountant, and me. It said that if the company's leadership was ever found falsifying financial records for personal gain, control of my inherited shares would activate immediately, without a vote, without a warning. She let that settle over the table like a weight lowering itself slowly onto his chest. Tomorrow morning, Nathaniel, you're going to find out exactly how much I inherited. Nathaniel laughed once, sharp and unconvincing, the sound of a man trying to talk his way out of a room that had already closed around him. I didn't falsify anything, he said. The board has approved every filing for 6 years. Grace tilted her head slightly. The board approved what you showed them, she said. I've had someone quietly reviewing every filing since March, comparing them against records my father kept privately, records you didn't know existed because you never respected him enough to learn how careful he was. Marcus, still standing beside the table, closed his eyes briefly, and in that moment, everyone at the surrounding tables understood that whatever was about to happen tomorrow morning was going to be far bigger than a comment about a pair of old shoes. By 7 the next morning, the 22nd floor of Ashcroft Industries had never been so full so early. Board members filed in with coffee they weren't drinking and phones they kept checking, word having spread overnight that something unusual had been called, something outside the normal quarterly rhythm they had all grown comfortable with under Nathaniel's leadership. Grace arrived at 7:15, no longer in the worn coat from the night before, but still without the polish this room was used to seeing, still herself, still unwilling to perform wealth she wasn't interested in proving. Mr. Rowe, her father's longtime attorney, walked beside her carrying a leather folder thick enough that several board members visibly straightened in their seats when they saw it. Nathaniel arrived last, later than a CEO should ever arrive to his own emergency meeting, his tie slightly crooked, his usual confidence replaced by the tight, controlled expression of a man who had spent the entire night on the phone with lawyers who had given him very little comfort. He sat at the head of the table out of habit, though several board members noticed Grace did not sit near him, choosing instead the seat beside Mr. Rowe, calm in a way that made the room more nervous than if she had walked in furious. "Let's begin," said the board chair, a woman named Diane Okafor who had served on this board since before Walter Ashcroft's death. "Mr. Rowe, you requested this meeting. The floor is yours." Mr. Rowe opened the leather folder and began speaking in the unhurried, precise tone of a man who has waited a long time to say something correctly. 6 years ago, Walter Ashcroft passed away and left controlling interest in this company in a trust for his daughter, to be held in dormant status until she reached the age of 40 or until a triggering clause was activated, he said. That clause specifies financial misconduct by executive leadership. 14 months ago, my office received an anonymous set of internal documents suggesting exactly that. We spent the better part of a year quietly verifying their authenticity, cross-referencing them against filings this board approved in good faith, believing they reflected the truth. He paused, letting the room absorb the shift in tense he had just used. Believing. Past tense. He slid a stack of documents down the table, copies landing in front of each board member like falling dominoes. "What you're holding," Mr. Rowe continued, "are the original financial records Walter Ashcroft kept in a private ledger before his death, alongside the versions Nathaniel Cross submitted to this board over the past 6 years. You'll notice the numbers do not match. Operating losses in 3 subsidiary divisions were reported as profits. Nearly $11 million was redirected through consulting contracts issued to companies that, as it turns out, do not actually exist." A board member near the end of the table set down his coffee, his hand no longer steady enough to hold it. Diane Okafor did not look up from the page in front of her, her jaw tightening with every line she read. Nathaniel found his voice for the first time since the meeting began, though it came out thinner than he wanted it to. "Those consulting firms are legitimate," he said. "You're twisting routine business arrangements into something they're not." Mr. Rowe did not raise his voice, which somehow made the moment land harder than shouting would have. Then you won't mind explaining, he said, why 3 of those companies share a registered address with a property owned by your brother-in-law, or why the payments began exactly 4 months after Walter Ashcroft's funeral, when you knew there was no one left in this building who would ask questions. The silence that followed was the kind that fills an entire floor of a building, the kind no one in the room dared to be the first to break. A younger board member, a man named Preston Hale who had joined only 2 years earlier and had built much of his early reputation on defending Nathaniel's leadership decisions in outside meetings, cleared his throat and asked the question everyone else seemed too stunned to voice. If this is true, he said slowly, then every projection we've given our shareholders for the last 2 years has been built on numbers that don't exist. We're not just talking about one man's dishonesty. We're talking about exposure the entire company could be liable for. Mr. Rowe nodded once, which is precisely why Ms. Ashcroft's counsel has already begun preparing a voluntary disclosure to regulators, he said. Getting ahead of this publicly will matter far more than trying to bury it privately, and Ms. Ashcroft insisted on transparency from the very first day this investigation began, regardless of what it might have cost her personally. Diane Okafor turned a page slowly, then another, her expression shifting from disbelief into something colder and more focused, the expression of someone recalculating 6 years of decisions she now understood had been made on false information. There's a line item here, she said, tapping the page, listed as Strategic Advisory Retainer, paid quarterly, totaling almost $4 million over 3 years. I approve this personally. I was told it covered outside counsel during the transition after Walter's death. She looked up at Nathaniel, and for the first time in the meeting, her voice carried something sharper than professional detachment. Was there ever outside counsel, Nathaniel? Or was I approving a payment to a shell company with your brother-in-law's name buried 3 layers deep in the paperwork? Nathaniel did not answer. He didn't need to. His silence answered for him, loud enough for everyone at the table to hear it clearly. It was Marcus who broke it instead, standing quietly near the back wall where he had been asked to wait in case his account of the events was needed. I can confirm the timeline, he said, his voice steadier now than it had been the night before, steadied by 6 years of guilt finally finding somewhere to go. I drove Mr. Ashcroft every day before he passed. The week before he died, he asked me to deliver a sealed envelope to Mr. Rowe's office personally, off the books, and told me not to mention it to anyone at the company, including Mr. Cross. He looked at Nathaniel directly for the first time since walking in. I didn't understand why at the time. I think I understand now. Diane Okafor finally looked up from the documents, her expression no longer neutral. Nathaniel, she said, the board is going to need you to step outside while we deliberate. It was not a request, and everyone in the room understood that immediately, including Nathaniel, whose composure finally cracked in a way it hadn't the night before in the restaurant, when he still believed the story was his to control. Grace, he said, turning to her, his voice dropping the polish entirely. You don't understand what it took to keep this company running after your father died. The board wanted someone decisive. I gave them decisive. Grace looked at him steadily. You gave them decisive, she said. You just forgot to give them honest. Nathaniel made one last attempt before security arrived, turning to the other board members with the tone of a man trying to remind everyone of the good times before the bill came due. I grew this company's revenue by 30%, he said. Whatever mistakes were made with the paperwork, the results speak for themselves. You don't fire someone who delivered results like that. Diane Okafor closed the folder in front of her with a quiet finality that carried more weight than if she had shouted. The results were fiction, Nathaniel, she said. You didn't grow this company. You hollowed it out and dressed the numbers up well enough that none of us bothered to check under the paint. That's not leadership. That's theft with a better vocabulary. Around the table, heads nodded slowly. Board members who had trusted him for years now recalculating every confident presentation he had ever given them, wondering how much of it had been real. He tried Grace next, softening his voice into something almost pleading, a tone she suspected he had never had to use in his life before that morning. You could have come to me privately, he said. We could have handled this quietly, protected the company's reputation, protected both of us. Grace studied him for a long moment before answering. You had 6 years to handle it privately, she said. You chose to spend that time pushing me out, mocking women you assumed had nothing, and hoping no one who mattered was ever paying attention. I'm not interested in protecting your reputation, Nathaniel. I'm interested in protecting everyone you decided didn't matter enough to tell the truth to. Security arrived at the door moments later, and Nathaniel's shoulders finally dropped, the fight visibly leaving him as he understood, at last, that no amount of charm was going to talk his way out of this room. He left the room escorted by building security less than an hour later, his access badge deactivated before he reached the elevator, his name already being quietly removed from the executive floor directory by a nervous assistant who had been given the task without explanation. The board voted unanimously to terminate his contract for cause, which meant no severance, no golden exit, nothing but the $11 million he would now spend the next several years trying to explain to federal investigators instead of board members. Diane Okafor turned to Grace once the room had cleared enough to breathe again. The trust names you as controlling shareholder, effective immediately, she said. The board would like to know whether you intend to take the chair position permanently or whether you're here for something else entirely. Grace was quiet for a moment, looking out at the city through the windows her father used to stand in front of every morning before the sun fully rose, back when this company still felt like something worth being proud of. I didn't come back for a title, she said finally. I came back because 6 years ago, I was pushed out of my own father's legacy by a man who decided a grieving daughter was easier to remove than a business partner he'd have to actually earn trust from. I spent those 6 years working double shifts, raising my son alone, wearing shoes I was mocked for last night by the same man who stole from the company my father built with his own hands. She turned back to the board. So yes, I'm staying. Not because I need the title, because I owe it to the people this company forgot to protect. Word of what happened at Ashcroft Industries moved through the company floor by floor before lunch, and by the time Grace walked the hallway toward what used to be her father's office, employees who had never met her were already standing a little straighter, already watching her with the particular attention people give someone whose story they've just heard secondhand and can't quite believe is true. She stopped at the office door, her hand resting on the frame for a moment longer than necessary, before stepping inside a room she hadn't entered in 6 years, a room that still, somehow, smelled faintly like the coffee her father used to drink before dawn. By the following morning, the story had left the building entirely. A financial reporter who had been quietly tipped off by someone inside the company published a piece on Nathaniel's termination before Ashcroft Industries had even issued its own statement, and within hours, the story of the mocked shoes and the driver's whispered warning had spread across social media in a way none of the board members had anticipated, told by strangers who had never set foot in the Kingsley room but understood exactly the kind of moment it represented. Grace hadn't wanted the attention. She had wanted the truth corrected quietly, cleanly, without turning her family's grief into a public spectacle, but she also understood, watching the comments pile up beneath the article, that there was something valuable in people seeing exactly what happens when cruelty meets consequence in full daylight. Marcus found her there an hour later, standing near the window with a box of her father's old belongings that had never been thrown away, only stored, as though someone in this building had always believed she would come back for them eventually. I should have said something sooner, Marcus said from the doorway. I knew things weren't right. I just didn't know how to prove it, and I was scared of what I'd lose if I tried. Grace turned to him, and for the first time since the restaurant, her expression softened into something closer to gratitude than grief. You kept the one thing that mattered, she said. You told the truth when it counted. That's more than most people in this building managed to do in 6 years. Grace spent that first week meeting with department heads who had spent 6 years afraid to raise concerns about numbers that didn't add up, afraid that questioning Nathaniel meant questioning their own job security. One by one, they came forward with small pieces they'd noticed and buried. A discrepancy here, a canceled audit there, none of them enough on their own to matter. All of them together painting a picture of exactly how long the deception had been allowed to continue simply because no one felt safe enough to say something out loud. Grace listened to every one of them personally, in her father's old office, taking notes by hand the way he used to, and by the end of that week, she had already begun drafting new internal policies designed to make sure silence was never again the safest option available to an honest employee. She offered Marcus a position on her new executive team that afternoon, not as a driver, but as someone who understood the company's culture from the ground floor up in a way no outside hire ever could. Someone who had proven, when it mattered most, that loyalty to the truth outweighed loyalty to a paycheck. He accepted before she finished the sentence. By the end of the week, the story of what happened in the Kingsley room had made its way through every floor of the building and well beyond it, told and retold by people who had been there and people who only wished they had. The story of a man who mocked a woman's shoes without ever once asking who was standing inside them. 6 months later, Ashcroft Industries posted its first fully transparent quarterly report in nearly a decade, numbers verified by 3 independent auditors. Numbers Grace insisted be published in full detail, even where they showed the company hadn't fully recovered yet from the damage Nathaniel had done. Investors who had expected panic found something else instead, a steadier, more honest company than the one they thought they'd been holding stock in all along. One whose new CEO answered hard questions directly instead of deflecting them with charm. Employee turnover, which had quietly spiked every year under Nathaniel's leadership, began falling for the first time in years, and an anonymous internal survey that spring showed a number Grace kept taped inside her desk drawer as a private reminder of what all of it had actually been for. 91% of employees said they finally felt safe raising concerns without fear of losing their jobs over it. Marcus settled into his new role faster than either of them expected, spending his mornings walking the floors instead of driving the streets, talking to employees who had never had a single conversation with anyone from leadership in years. He kept a small photograph on his new desk, one Grace had given him from her father's old office, the 3 of them together at a company picnic more than a decade earlier, taken before any of this had happened, back when trust between people in this building had still felt like something ordinary instead of something rare enough to be worth protecting. He looked at it most mornings before his first meeting, a reminder of exactly what silence had cost, and exactly what speaking up, even 6 years too late, had finally managed to fix. Her son asked her about it a few nights later, curled up on the couch with his library book finally returned, wanting to know why people at his school had suddenly started asking if his mom was that lady from the news. Grace sat beside him and told him the truth as simply as she could, that sometimes people judge you by what you're wearing instead of who you are, and that the best answer to that kind of judgment isn't anger, it's patience, and eventually the truth catching up to people who never bothered to look past the surface in the first place. He seemed satisfied with that answer in the easy way children are satisfied with things that make sense to them, and asked if they could get pizza to celebrate. And Grace laughed for what felt like the first time in longer than she could remember, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she hadn't had much reason for in 6 long years. Grace kept those shoes, oddly enough, tucked in the back of her closet at home, not out of sentiment for the humiliation, but as a reminder of something she never wanted to forget once the corner offices and boardroom seats became familiar again. She wore new shoes to work most days now, practical ones, nothing that announced wealth she'd never cared to perform in the first place. But every so often, on a hard day, she would look at the old pair sitting quietly on the closet shelf and remember exactly who she was the night a rich man decided her worth could be measured by the soles of her feet, and exactly who she became by morning, when the truth finally caught up to him instead. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe so you never miss the next one.